David, thank you so much for joining. It's such a pleasure to have you here. For those who don't know, David Heinemeier Hansson is entrepreneur, an author, a programmer, a podcaster, racing driver, so many things in one person. How do you manage to do it all?
Well, I've had 43 years to rack those things up. It didn't all happen in a week.
Fair enough.
So that helps.
I was actually going to mention that because you've been at it for more than 20 years. I think
Yes.
You created the framework Ruby on Rails, which you're quite famous for in development circles and beyond, but that was almost 20 years ago when you...
20 years ago this year, yes.
Crazy times. So do you still remember the days when you came up with the idea to start your own web framework?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm still heavily involved with the development of Ruby on Rails. I never left, so to speak. This is my life's work in terms of tooling. At our company, we love building our own tools. I love building my own tools. It's the great expression of independence of the web that you can build your own tools. So I'm still heavily involved with Ruby on Rails. We just started a new foundation this year, the Rails Foundation, that's going to put on a great event in October in Amsterdam for anyone who's interested in that, to celebrate the 20-year anniversary of Ruby on Rails.
Fantastic. You write a lot. Do you still write code, though? Do you still program at all?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think an absolutely terrible month is a month without code for me. Programming and being involved with the creation of the products, of the tools, and so on is why I continue to be involved with this, is what keeps driving me forward. If my job had been reduced to just a hashtag executive life, a bunch of meetings and calendar shufflings and Tetris, like, I would have quit a long time ago.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. The company that you mentioned, but didn't name, was 37 Signals. Basecamp, of course, being the most famous product. That was also 20 years ago when you founded the company, or almost 20 years ago. Do you still remember those early days of building the company, the reason why you started it in the first place, and how those first years came about?
Yeah, it's still very bright. I mean, I haven't had any breaks in that duration. I have one line item on my LinkedIn profile, and it just says 37 Signals, 21 and a half years. That is really the sum, more or less, of my career. I had a little bit of experience in the Danish tech scene before joining 37 Signals, but that is also my life's work. And as such, we've kept to the original founding principles. A lot of the founders you've had up here have talking about scale-ups. Oh, we used to be 4 people, and now we are 800 or 8,000 or whatever. We started with 4 people, and now we are the biggest we've ever been, and it's 75. So the distance between 4 people and 75 is large, but it's not huge like it is going to thousands. So that whole journey is still there. We're still working on the original product, which is amazing enough in itself. Basecamp, our project management tool, was released February 1st, 2004. Almost 20 years ago. It was SaaS before there was something called SaaS. It was this time where we actually had to convince banks to allow us to accept credit card payment. So it had some different challenges, but in many ways it's also exactly the same as it is today. You have to make something that people want, and they don't just have to want it, they also have to want to pay for it. And that became the sort of ethos of how we ran the business, creating products that we charge money for right from day one, and we make more money than we spend. It is such a simple recipe, but it is a recipe for staying in business, and that's what we've done for now 24 years. 37 Signals was founded in '99. Every single year has been profitable since day one. And it's just been interesting to see through, 3 or 4 downturns. I was there during the original .com boom and bust, then there during the 2008 crisis, and now we're in another crisis of sorts, and just sitting a bit on the sidelines and observing the madness, and just thinking, it's actually kind of nice just sitting here over in a little boat that just continues to be profitable year after year.
I think that's fantastic. And you mentioned 2008. That's around the time I started reading your blog as well. I was working at TechCrunch at the time. Gosh, it's almost 15 years ago, isn't it? And I remember you being sort of a lonely voice in the world of startups and venture capital, the whole Web 2.0 movement, where you were very anti-venture capital. You were saying basically those are sharks, don't do it, don't get involved with investors, which is quite different from most of the conversations we have in the startup world. Is that still the case? Are you still anti-VC?
I think that the funny thing when you say the same thing for 20 years, the pendulum swings back and forth. We've just been in the longest bull run for startup funding that industry has ever seen, from 2008, 2009 onwards to till about 5 minutes ago. It was just go, 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 bigger, bigger, bigger. And it's quite hard to say what we've been saying for 20 years in an environment like that, saying like, hey, actually you should be a little bit careful with the VCs. If you take a high valuation and it then dips, life is not going to be so pleasant for you. It's so much easier to have that conversation now. Because suddenly, most participants in that conversation enters with a context of, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I've seen valuations come down 80%. I've seen the layoff rounds. I've seen actually having to worry about boring things like making money again. And that's been an ethos we've been on since the beginning. It's funny you mentioned TechCrunch, because Michael Arrington, the original founder of TechCrunch, wrote an article in 2007 basically saying 37 Signals killed another startup with their irresponsible rhetoric about making money. Like, that was a real thing that people used to believe, that you could be a startup and it didn't have to have any connection whatsoever to business fundamentals. You didn't have to make money. Like, somehow, magic step 2, you would just end up with a big pot of gold without having to figure out the dynamics of making money. And I think that Arrington worldview has been the dominant one over my 20-year career. But then there's been these openings where the pendulum swings back for a couple of years, where people suddenly realize that fundamentals still matter and the law of gravity still applies.
Yeah, and that's the time we're living now.
That's exactly the time we're living in now. So it's just, it's funny to see a lot of even VCs rediscover things like, oh, no, actually we should worry about profitability, we should pull down our burn, we should do all of these other things, tactics for how to run a business that they were adamantly opposed to 5 minutes ago. Yeah,
no, I get that. But at the same time, you're also an investor. You do invest in startups, but then on your website it says, I actively help them avoid venture capital. So that's a bit of a juxtaposition, because of course you want those companies to scale, you're an investor yourself, but you don't want them to raise VC. So how does that work?
Yes, I think this is one of the insidious things about venture capital, that somehow venture capitalists monopolize the word investment. Like, that was their entire domain. Anything investment is venture capital, which is of course total bullshit. Venture capital is a very specific form of investment that's predicated on these home run successes. That if I invest in 10 startups, one of them is going to pay back the rest. We're going to have a unicorn, and that unicorn is going to be worth billions, so who cares what we waste on the rest? That's not the only form of investment that exists. There are many other forms of investments where you take a different look at the odds and of the outcomes, where you don't go for the long shot, you go for base hits. That's the kind of investment that I'm interested in. I'm interested in helping predominantly Danish startups. I'm from Denmark, and I've been living in Copenhagen for the last 3 years, and I thought, like, hey, what do we need to do such that this entire crop of startups do not end up in the hands of venture capitalists? I would like to keep some startups out of the hands of venture capitalists, such that we can get some different kinds of companies, built on different ethics, built on different business models, built on different trajectories. But it is difficult in the beginning as a startup. Like, how do you get just enough to get going? Once you get going, once you're rolling, you don't need the venture capital. That was our own story, the story that we proved over 20 years, is that we just needed a bit to get going. We self-funded, bootstrapped it by having a consultancy pay the bills until we were up and running. Not everyone has that opportunity, so I go in and try to help someone get through that. But every single investment I've made has been on the handshake deal that this should be the last money.
That's fantastic.
That won't happen in all cases, but that should be the intention, that we're not here to start a Series A, B, C, D, E, F, bankrupt approach to funding the business, just enough to get to profitability. Profitability means independence, it means freedom, it means an unlimited runway. It may take a little longer, not in all cases, but I believe it gives you far better odds. And that's the kind of startups I want to support.
Fantastic and very refreshing. You're also an author, you're a best-selling author. You've co-authored 4 books with your co-founder, Jason Fried. I want to go back to the first one that you've ever written, was Getting Real, which is about sort of the backstory behind 37 Signals and how you've scaled. On your website, it's still on point. What is so still on point about it, and why should people read it?
Well, I think when we wrote Getting Real, we were simply trying to create a catalog of the lessons that we have made creating Basecamp. Because we created Basecamp at a time where SaaS was not a common approach to software. It was not a common approach to startups. And we thought, like, you know what? I think we figured a few things out here about how to bootstrap that, how to get started, how to hire, how to market without a budget, how to use PR and developing an audience as an alternative to raising a ton of money and buying banner ads or whatever else people were doing back in 2005. And creating a culture that is congruent with the kind of people we wanted to be and the company we wanted to run. And much of that ended up being in opposition to the kind of companies that came out of the Silicon Valley startup mill. And those startup mills just ended up producing such a narrow vision of what internet businesses should be like, and how they should operate, and how they should hire, and how they should market, that we thought, you know what, we need a counter melody. We need someone else saying different things. Otherwise, entrepreneurs are going to end up with this tunnel vision that there's just this one way of doing things, there's one playbook, and it always goes through sort of these funding cycles, and you end up with the same kinds of companies with the same kind of ethics. First of all, that's just boring, in my opinion. Second of all, I don't think it's good for the economy. I think it's actually terrible for the economy if all the interest into creating tech companies goes through unicorn vision. We need far greater variety and diversity amongst tech companies than just a bunch of people trying to get to $1 billion. It'd be nice if we had like a middle stand, as we talk about with the German companies that are medium-sized, that you have a stronger economy if you have more companies in that economy. I think the great tragedy of Silicon Valley is the fact that it's produced just a handful of slam dunk home run successes that's paid for all the lavishes of Silicon Valley through monopolization. We end up with a worse economy, worse especially for Europe. We've been colonized at this point by the American tech giants, and yet we still cheer them on now, how great it is that they've been able to put on this on. We need something else. We need a different vision, and I think the vision we've been trying to build for the entire time we've been in business, what we write about, what I invest into, is a more European way of looking at things. That the economy thrives when we have tens of thousands of companies, not just 5 that own everything.
Well, you write about this, and obviously you build companies like this, but you also want to play a more active role. So you do get involved in sort of the regulation and policy side of things. You want to weigh on the EU and US regulators. You're an antitrust advocate, as you mentioned on your website. What does it actually translate to? What does that concretely mean? Like, how do you spend time with them? Does it pay off?
Yeah, so I really got radicalized about 2 years ago when we launched Hey.com, our new email service. We thought, hey, we're launching a new email service. It's going to take on Gmail. That's quite the gorilla behemoth in the industry. That's going to be difficult enough. But we didn't account for the fact that before we could even take on Gmail, we first had to take on Apple, because we published our app in the App Store, and they gave us permission to be there for about 2 days. Then they showed up with a baseball bat and said, we're going to wreck your business unless you give us 30% of your revenues.
Right,
you have to process all your payments through us. And we went, no, that is ridiculous. So we had a long fight with Apple over that. And I really just got enraged and engaged in the antitrust fight, first in the US and then a little bit in Europe. Speaking to Congress in the US had a big antitrust process. They were trying to figure out what to do. Nothing came of that, unfortunately. A bunch of state houses tried to do that. Nothing came of that. South Korea tried. Nothing came of that. Now it seems perhaps finally something is going to come of it. It's going to be in Europe. The Digital Markets Act that goes into effect next year is our last best hope, I'd say. Otherwise, it's almost all for naught. But I have become a bit disillusioned with the whole process, I got to say. Also just because it's such a crapshoot. On the one hand, we can be thankful and look at the EU and say, like, they might actually do something with the Digital Markets Act, or we might end up with just another embarrassment like the cookie banner bullshit, right? Like, what did we get out of the GDPR? I actually thought that the GDPR had a lot of good thoughts in it. That was 10 years ago. What have we gotten out of it? What has it created? What has it enabled? Absolutely nothing of value to consumers or to businesses. It has enriched an entire industry of consultants and lawyers, very effective at that. A bunch of bureaucrats got to celebrate themselves that they did something. They did nothing. This latest judgment against Meta, Facebook here, ooh, we taxed them $1 billion on sending some data one way or the other. What does it matter? You're just spinning the wheel. So it is easy to get disillusioned with that, and it's also difficult to be enthusiastic about the process when you see, you know what, this Leviathan, the EU, that has the promise of correcting markets and creating the free marketplace we all want, also has the power, for example, to ban end-to-end encryption. And you know what? I'm not sure I want those free markets if it also means we're going to lose end-to-end encryption. So difficult, delicate game. I'm more disillusioned than when I started, but you got to keep the hope, and you got to keep fighting. Otherwise, yeah, might as well just lay down and die.
At the very least, you got involved and you think about this stuff, because a lot of people just don't. They build their companies and they sort of operate in a vacuum, which you can't. Not anymore, at least.
Yeah, no, I think it is coming to a forefront, and I think it's also going to come to a head. All these tiny moves in the GDPR is just one tipping point away from making it illegal for European companies to send any kind of data to US-owned companies. I think that would actually be something that changed something. Change for good or bad, I'm not entirely sure, but at least it'd be interesting.
Right. We don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to mention comm companies, which is sort of a concept that is visible throughout your books. What is a comm company and what does it mean? And what takeaways from the books can you give in, like, I don't know, 50 seconds?
Sure. I think the fundamental for me is a comm company is one that does not put growth above all else, which is actually why comm companies are in direct opposition and conflict with venture capital funded companies. Because the primary directive of a venture capital funded company is to put growth above all else. So we wanted to put forward a positive vision that it doesn't have to be like that. In the venture capital world, for example, the plateau is usually the plateau of death. Right? Once growth stops being astronomical, you're no longer interesting. Well, we've lived on a plateau for at least a good 10 years where business has sort of just been stable. And by stable, I mean creating tons of profits that we got to keep, millions and millions of dollars spewing out of this cash machine that is a well-run SaaS company. You know what? That's a wonderful plateau. Do you know what you can build on a plateau? You can build a house. You can build a home. It's a great way to be. On a steep angle, very hard to build something, very easy to tumble down. So I'm a huge fan of plateaus. Plateaus are the enabler of comm companies. Giving up on growth being the be-all and end-all of everything that comes to startups is something I wish more companies would take on board.
That is a perfect note to end on, so I'm going to wrap it up here. David, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for the insights.
All right, thank you.
Really appreciate it.